distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as Tom mentioned, I've been asked today to comment to you about the question of how important or how relevant perhaps was this nation's response to the crisis in East Timor back in 1999 for contemporary Australia and contemporary Australians. I won't dwell on this, but previous speakers have explained to us the critical political and strategic circumstances of the crisis and the ADF's contribution to it in the form of INTERFET. It was, just to recap, the biggest deployment of ADF personnel since the Second World War, larger than Vietnam at its peak in 1967, and the first time this nation had led such a large multinational force, and all, as has been noted, from a reasonably standing start. In short, at least in my view, INTERFET was the most complex strategic challenge this nation had faced, at least since the 1940s. Moreover, once more, as has been noted, the operation proved to be one of the most successful UN-mandated peacemaking operations yet seen. My point is, such a triumph had repercussions both in East Timor, of course, but also in Canberra. INTERFET defined the career of its commander, the then Major General Peter Cosgrove, for example, and framed John Howard's Prime Ministership. It might be said that all that followed in the new millennium were in some ways aftershocks compared to how he emerged as a national security leader from 1999. It's to some of these issues, and to a number of others upon which I'll focus, and all in a current context of my role as a official historian, as Tom mentioned, of a multi-volume history dealing with Australian involvement in Iraq from 2003 to 2011, from Afghanistan from 2001 to 14, and from East Timor from 1999 to 2012. The importance of this project, at least for me, speaks to itself. Around 60,000 ADF and public service personnel have served or supported these deployments over some 15 years of operations. Sadly, 44 Australians have lost their lives on active service in these theatres, and hundreds more have been wounded. The social and military effects of these conflicts globally and within this country have been profound. The latest official history series is the 6th, produced by Australia, and continues, as was mentioned, a tradition begun by Charles Bean as General Editor and Principal Author of a 15-volume official history of Australia in the War of 1914-18. There is no question that each of the other official histories have followed or have faced their own specific challenges and enjoyed their own individual advantages. Yet, the effort to chronicle the wide range of ADF operations, both near and far from our shores over this 15-year period, marks an entirely new paradigm. This is especially so in terms of the sensitivities and security considerations associated with the unprecedented impact of intelligence and the intelligence agencies, for example, on tactical military operations. It's also true of the mechanics of research which have changed and the broader environment under which my team has laboured. It's less so, of course, in terms of the tradition behind past official history series, which we hope to extend and perhaps even enhance. My commission from Prime Minister Turnbull provides for controlled access of relevant government files and records subject only to national security considerations. Though these volumes will themselves be unclassified and written with this outcome in mind, they're based upon a thorough survey and analysis of the classified documentary record. Material excluded from my team, in whole or part, is that judged by relevant agencies as potentially damaging to the Australian national security or directly the national interest. Those agencies which have chosen to restrict their cooperation and access have thus done so on these grounds. I honestly do not expect such omissions will alter the conclusions reached in any volumes, including the volume concerned with INTERFET, in any fundamental manner. I would note, though, the era when military histories might be written exclusively from defence records has long passed. Like the operations they describe, these volumes have required input from whole of government sources. To this end, the studies are based not only on official defence records, but documents sourced from a range of departments and a range of agencies, including all 6 intelligence agencies. In some instances, this record is not as complete as might have been hoped given the speed of events unfolding, particularly in 1999, also by the challenges posed by archiving and the growth of electronic media and record storage across this period. In any case, such a record has been supplemented by an extensive interviewing program, upwards of 2,000 interviews we will have conducted by the time the project's complete, vital for getting behind some of the artificial consensus that sometimes one gets from documents. At their heart, these volumes are written for the tens of thousands of Australians who deployed on these operations in these theatres from 1999 to 2014, and for the tens of thousands more that supported them on a professional level or emotionally with love and best wishes for safe returns at home. They're also written to shed light for the wider Australian community who perhaps only had a passing connection to the events at hand. They're written, one hopes, for the interests and the educations for generations not yet born when East Timor won its independence. To this end, this series is then just a start, an important first brick perhaps, in a foundation of scholarship that will grow, especially once the documents upon which we've based our conclusions begin to enter the public purview. So, in terms of the volume concerned specifically with the crisis of 1999, which I myself have authored, a draft of which is complete, and the enduring impact of the times, let me assure you from the beginning that for all that's happened since, politicians, policymakers, military officers at the very highest levels worried more about what might unfold in the lead up to and as INTERFET deployed than over any other issue, any other times in their careers beforehand and generally at any other time afterwards. This was our backyard. It involved our most important northern neighbour. It was also our show. If it went badly, and this was perceived at the time as a real risk, the consequences were potentially disastrous. There is no question in this context that as September 1999 approached, the high-level machinery of Australian national security that Alan talked about was feeling the strain. Faced with a looming reality of a direct military intervention in Timor, the antithesis of long-standing political and diplomatic objectives, the atmosphere at the National Security Committee of Cabinet, for example, moved from tension to stress. Tension also permeated relationships between key departments in Canberra. That between the Foreign and Defence Ministers, for one, was less than cordial and less than effective. As the likelihood of military options took centre stage, so did the Department of Defence, and the transition to a defence-led policy making was not without its frictions for those agencies more accustomed to setting the agenda, such as Foreign Affairs and Prime Minister and Cabinet. In short, as was alluded to earlier, NSC laid down 4 conditions that needed to be met before INTERFET might be executed. Indonesian consent, of course, UN authorisation, a clear endorsement by a significant proportion of ASEAN member states, and active US support. Active US support included a guarantee for real military assistance should the deployment face serious challenge. Efforts in this regard, as Mr Howard alluded to earlier, did get off to a somewhat shaky start. The Prime Minister rang President Clinton in the first week of September to specifically discuss what assistance the Americans might provide for an Australian intervention and to emphasise the personal preference for US combat boots on the ground. The response was surprising, with Clinton emphasising the overstretched nature of the US military and hostility within Congress to further interventions of this type. The Foreign Minister Alexander Downer was similarly stunned and allowed his disappointment to show on an interview with CNN, which led to a frank exchange of views with the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, with Mr Downer again emphasising his disappointment at the negative sounds emanating from Washington on US involvement and reiterating the material and symbolic value of overt US support. Yet policymakers at the Pentagon soon took the point. Australia had been there for the US in the past and was expected to be there in the future. It was time perhaps for some quid pro quo. Not long afterwards, Washington did indeed confirm that all Australian requests would be met, including the commitment to backstop the ADF if things got too far out of hand, but with the continuing caveat that US combat soldiers would not deploy in any other than an extreme situation. NSC was briefed accordingly and confirmed once again that it wanted a watertight guarantee that if the Indonesian Armed Force resisted operation, then the US would intervene. and for this message to be relayed to Jakarta in advance. Again, the green light was given. Never let it be said the Americans weren't there. Independently and with little reference to the Pentagon, US Pacific Command also had plans drawn up, or had been drawing up plans in the interim to help withdraw a UN force should Timor erupt, fight in Timor erupt with significant elements of the Indonesian military. Once more, stressing the perceived danger, on the 8th of September, 12 days from H hour, public statements from Indonesia seemed to indicate Jakarta would not accept a UN-sponsored intervention, thus removing one of the NSC's 4 key conditions. Repeating a warning originally given to diplomats at the UN on the 4th of September, the Indonesian Foreign Minister Ali Alatas warned any nations willing to send peacekeepers to the province might have to shoot their way in. This was followed by reports by Indonesia's air chief warning that his forces, in the Jakarta Post that is, quote, ready to face any intruders from Australia. Planners and policymakers across government and the ADF correctly assumed that such sabre-rattling could not hold back the rising tide of international pressure, but serious conflict always remained a terrifying possibility. Nor were fears solely based on the potential reactions by the Indonesian military. Self-styled militias in the province, with uniformed backing, were a threat in their own right. A draft press statement prepared for the Chief of the Defence Force on the 10th of December was clear in this regard. My information, based on eyewitness accounts from my own people and other information sources, it read, is that militias armed with modern small arms have been conducting an orchestrated campaign of terror with TNI support and cooperation in, quote, a blatant act of duplicity. Meanwhile, militia leaders and anti-independence figures in the troubled province made predictions of their own. Governor Soares, for example, warned, quote, if Australia sends a peacekeeping force, we'll be ready for them. There are thousands of us still. We'll face them. We'll fight you when you arrive. Even back in Jakarta, one key advisor to President Habibie was reported in the Indonesian press as stating that Australian servicemen and women might be singled out for attack. She repeated the warning on the Australian SBS Dateline program on the evening of the 15th of September. Meanwhile, through various means, militia leaders expressed their own desires to exact a toll of blood of any foreign troops who might deign enter the province. Thus, for all the assumptions regarding outward Indonesian cooperation, or at least toleration of the INTERFET landings, Australian planners could never fully discount a doomsday scenario of a significant conflagration with the Indonesian military. Given the, quote, considerable evidence of cooperation between TNI and the militias, noted Defence Minister Moore, quote, one has to be prepared for any eventuality. In an appreciation submitted to NSC 72 hours before the launch of INTERFET, the CDF stressed while conventional Indonesian forces would likely cooperate to a degree and then be withdrawn, militia groups, possibly backed by special forces, would likely try to test INTERFET's resolve. He also emphasised that the government could not discount the possibility of a spiralling set of circumstances that might lead to a wider conflict. Even though the Indonesians had agreed to an intervention, one argument ran, there was no guarantee their own political leadership could fully control all of the instruments at the military's disposal. There's also little doubt that in what would invariably be a charged environment in Dili on the 20th of September, it might only take one small spark to accidentally ignite a more serious incident. So in this context, on the very eve of INTERFET, the 19th of September, the Prime Minister, Mr Howard, the Leader of the Opposition, Kim Beazley, and the Leader of the Democrats, Meg Lees, along with Minister Moore and the CDF, gathered in Townsville to farewell the troops. The Prime Minister seemed emotional, aware of the uncertainty of what lay ahead, while the deployment of SASR to Kuwait in 1998 might likely have shaped government thinking about the use of force, and perhaps even increased its confidence to do so in its second term. INTERFET was an order of magnitude beyond this decision. Mr Howard himself later described the choice to deploy the ADF as far and away one of the most significant his government had yet taken. After the formalities, politicians and senior ADF officers dined in the soldiers' mess, once more bringing home the personal aspects of what was about to unfold. As they walked, the Prime Minister and his wife saw NCOs and groups of soldiers talking. He stopped to speak with them, all the while conscious some may not come home. The Prime Minister felt the burden, as I'm sure did many other Australian elites. So there was good reason to worry, even beyond the serious loss of life that might have accompanied even a short-term fight with elements of the Indonesian military, for the effect of such in the region would have been disastrous on multiple levels, most obviously diplomatic and economic levels. But here's the point. For all the sleepless nights, INTERFET went well. Much was achieved at relatively little human cost. As the deployment unfolded, smiles began to replace worried scowls in this town. Much political capital was garnered. Decision makers at the political and strategic level certainly emerged from the Timor crisis with a greater knowledge of and perhaps confidence in the application of military force than might previously have been the case. To what degree such factors subsequently shaped decisions to employ the ADF at different times and different theatres is perhaps impossible to judge. It is equally hard not to speculate. Just as it was for so many within the ADF, Timor was the start rather than the end of experience of deployment for many decision makers right up to the most senior levels. Had operations in Timor not concluded in triumph, it is not too much to wonder how much more different recent Australian military history might be. Political elites aside, I'd further argue that the Timor crisis left its indelible mark, as has been mentioned a few times today, on the Australian community. Remarkably, as events in the troubled province came to a head in September, the Australian public demanded a military intervention. And one on a scale not seen since Vietnam. It did so in an age of instant communications and the saturation of traditional and internet reporting with images and atrocities being perpetrated in Timor in the full knowledge of the dangers involved. This was a remarkable turnaround in terms of public acceptance of the use of force and deployment of Australian troops abroad. It was perhaps a signal of shifting attitudes in a post-Vietnam populace. Domestic pressure associated with how and when the government should react to the situation in Timor ramped up exponentially and in direct proportion to the dramatic upturn in violence from the first week of September. The terrible crimes in the province were comprehensively reported by the Australian media, and we've talked about their bravery earlier today, and such images created public outrage. Most often this took the forms, as the Prime Minister earlier explained, of calls to immediately deploy the ADF, from talkback radio to opposition taunting. All major newspapers argued for an immediate Australian involvement. The Prime Minister's office was flooded by letters from state politicians, religious leaders, interest groups, unions and private citizens. The situation was the same in the Defence Minister's office, inundated with calls for actions across the full spectrum of the Australian community, from school children to retirees. In response to a deluge of questions in Parliament, Mr Downer could only exasperatedly repeat, as the Prime Minister had, a deployment of Australian peacekeepers in advance of a formal agreement was tantamount to a declaration of war. Though entirely true, these were increasingly unsatisfactory answers for a public and Parliament shocked by what it was witnessing. Such was the power of those images. As each day ticked by, those images of the raising of Dili and the suffering of the Timorese continued to assail Australians on their nightly news programs and were the subject of any number of heated debates in cafes and over dinner tables. The Sydney Morning Herald on the 8th of September represented what was rapidly becoming a public consensus. Quote, "The immediate and urgent question is what must be done to stop further crimes. The short answer is whatever it takes." Public rallies had begun in Sydney as early as the 6th of September, when Timorese activists and several hundred trade unionists protested outside the Sydney offices of Garuda Airlines, calling for the deployment of an international force. 2 days later, a larger rally was held in the city with 4,000 city workers walking off their jobs. Garbage workers in Sydney, with the support of the Randwick Council, refused to pick up rubbish from the Indonesian consulate. Printing workers refused to print Indonesian products. The Maritime Union of Australia prevented loading of cargo on all Indonesia-bound ships. Public agitation was peaking. A rally in Sydney on Saturday the 11th, it began in Hyde Park with 15,000 attendees and ended with double that number. It was a similar situation in Melbourne, where around 30,000 people rallied in the city at short notice on the 10th of September and 40,000 on the march on Sunday the 19th of September as INTERFET prepared to deploy. The Australian public over this period had grown ever more strident in its demands for action. Now, I'm not suggesting, and it would be foolish to suggest, that such civic activism forced the government's hand on the issue. Of course it did not. The movement towards a deployment was well advanced before these rallies had got into full swing. But they were critical background music for politicians and decision makers who didn't have to look hard to predict the consequences of rapidly not taking decisive action. I think this next point's important. Conversely, as INTERFET began, as it began to be successful, public images and the public memory began to drift from these strategic and political calculations, from policy, from operational missteps, and even from the horrific crimes perpetuated against the Timorese. Rather, in no time flat, these were replaced by images of faces of locals smiling, families rebuilding their lives amidst the rubble that had been bequeathed to them. These were the enduring images of INTERFET. The feeling of helping a desperate and grateful people is what INTERFET veterans carried home with them. This was the achievement beyond all else that is said and written about Australian operations in this period. This legacy will endure. But at the same time, there is uneasiness. The Chief of Army in 1999, Lieutenant General Frank Hickling, told a parliamentary committee in June the next year, the final lesson we need to absorb, not only as an army but as a society, is INTERFET was not war. Yet East Timor felt like victory from its initial deployment until its welcome home parade. To what extent then did this experience shape the Australian community's attitude and acceptance to the use of Australian military power abroad in the early years of the new millennium? To what degree were lingering fears and suspicions of deploying Australian troops overseas, fears older in this country than Federation, allied by INTERFET's accomplishments? To follow this line of thinking, how much did such feelings feed into subsequent political, diplomatic, military calculations? If the ADF in 1999 received a bloody nose, would subsequent deployment still have occurred, at least on the scale and duration that unfolded thereafter? Let me switch gears now to discuss another aspect of Timor crisis and its long-term impact. It is important to understand that ADF operations in Timor were not the product of a considered and long-term strategic planning and policy process, but rather, in some ways, the failure of that process. There was, to be blunt, a chasm between what the government wanted to achieve in East Timor, the second half of 1998, to what was actually achieved by February 2000. Australian policymakers never sought East Timorese independence until that choice was made for them. And we talked about President Habibie's shock announcement. On the contrary, the chain of events leading to Timorese independence was born out of what a group of Australian policymakers perceived as a moment of opportunity created by the fall of President Suharto to legitimise, perhaps, ongoing Indonesian incorporation of the province. Doing so would remove the burr under the saddle in the bilateral relationship and diminish the international stigma generated by Indonesia's ongoing occupation of the territory, a stigma so carefully, stubbornly and successfully husbanded by the East Timor solidarity and lobby groups around the globe for a quarter of a century. The tears of joy and dilly shed by locals as INTERFET deployed thus represented, on one level, an Australian policy reversal. There has been, noted one former and very senior official at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, quote, a lot of sort of post-event rewriting of history here about Australia being the liberator of East Timor. Being the liberator was the last things on our mind. Indeed, it's not too much to suggest that had policymakers written a script in mid-1998 as to what disaster might look like regarding East Timor in a post-Suharto region, perhaps only outright war with over the territory between Australia and Indonesia might have been worse than what transpired from that policy perspective in 1999. Worse in many ways, Australian bureaucrats had perhaps brought this on themselves. A week into the INTERFET deployment, the Prime Minister told the House that 13 years of predominantly ALP foreign policy failure and neglect had, more than anything else, created the crisis in East Timor, and further, over the previous 25 years, he believed governments of both political persuasions had gotten it wrong in relation to East Timor policy, himself included, with the inference that now things were going to be put right. While I have no doubt such sentiments were sincere, they do not match the bureaucratic policy position and actions taken in Canberra in the lead up to the INTERFET deployment. As conceded by a very senior defence official at the time, quote, "The government endorsed public narrative is perhaps not the real historical narrative." Now, none of this is to cast moral or ethical judgment on the government, on bureaucrats or policymakers for their actions or their ideas. All actors, as far as might be sensibly judged, operated in good faith. But faithfulness ought to be understood in terms of what was perceived as very much a realist interpretation of the Australian national interest. There was no conspiracy in Canberra, as some of my academic peers might like to suggest. No cabal of the faceless twisting policy to their own ends. Instead, there was a powerful official consensus that assessed Australia's interest to be best served by stability and security, perceived to have been provided by a strong Indonesia which incorporated East Timor, and a strong bilateral relationship between Canberra and Jakarta. Most senior diplomats and policymakers were adamant on this point, reflecting a powerful generational outlook and a dominant orthodoxy. Whether I agree with this or not, this consensus has its logic, and that logic stands. The wider point, though, is perhaps such a disconnect between public policy and public expectation has a legacy all of its own. After INTERFET had run its course, the politics of what had led to its creation began to rankle many veterans. As I've said, I've spoken to around 500 of them from '99. At one level, most understood the practical need to establish as close as possible cooperative relationship with Jakarta as soon as possible. Pardon me. Yet for many, an unsettled feeling remains. Thousands of Australian servicemen and servicewomen saw with their own eyes what unfolded in East Timor and who had been responsible. Hundreds of their more senior and non-commissioned officers with access to intelligence product and collected observation knew this with some depth. Dozens of high-ranking officers in East Timor and back in Australia, along with their civilian counterparts across multiple agencies, knew this with considerable detail. Nearly 20 years later, those involved are almost unanimous in their assessments of how the violence in Timor was perpetrated and who was responsible. At the time, ADF members did not need to reconcile such issues. They just needed to get on with the job. More broadly, though, years later, the passage of time and space for reflection is such that many veterans bear a legacy of considerable discomfort about answers to questions no one in 1999 wanted to ask. Finally, let me reflect on Timor's enduring influence upon the ADF as an organisation and the widest national security apparatus, without repeating earlier speakers. The crisis was without doubt, in my view, as has been said, a crucible that both tested and forged the Australian national security system. NSC, ministers, various intelligence agencies and a range of government departments, not just defence, gained much valuable experience as a result. New systems, new structures were put in place, new pecking orders emerged. The relationship between defence and DFAT, for example, found a fresh equilibrium. Critics have called it a militarisation of foreign policy. Advocates a confirmation the military could be used as an instrument of strategic policy rather than something separate from it or entirely subordinate to it. So too, the agencies of the intelligence community found the distinctions between operational and strategic level intelligence were rapidly disappearing. Intelligence capabilities previously regarded as the realm of civilian specialists were used to provide direct operational support for the ADF, which required a redefinition of these roles and functions. This operationalisation of traditionally strategic agency began in Timor and continued apace in this vein moving forward. Meanwhile, while the plaudits are all well-deserved, make no mistake, the events of '99 rocked the Department of Defence and the ADF to its core. thanks to the international context of this deployment, overt US posturing, and decisions made by the Indonesian government and military, and we often forget the advocacy of the Indonesian government and military, thanks to decisions explicitly made over the other side of the hill, as someone used that phrase earlier, the INTERFET deployment never came close to failure, but it was also not challenged in a serious or systematic manner. The ADF did not stumble in Timor, but nor was it seriously pushed. The process of mounting these operations, though, even in a largely uncontested environment, did expose the organisation to scrutiny and tested it like no peacetime exercise ever could. Well, I have no time for details. Let me assure you, the process and costs of what's been called the long peace were exposed, ADF resources were stretched, and a gap was revealed between advertised and actual capability. It's further appropriate, without venturing into the certainty of rigorous debate, to briefly reflect on the cultural impact of INTERFET on the ADF. With the exception of a number of high readiness units, an essentially peace-oriented defence force was shaken from its torpor, Alan, to use your word. Old assumptions were challenged. The INTERFET mission, for instance, was the first time Australian women were operationally deployed in large numbers on active service. At its height, this figure approached around 420 of 5,500, a reasonably high percentage, though still one lower than the overall proportion of women in the ADF in 1999. So too, and interestingly, Australian Special Forces emerged with a greatly enhanced reputation and with the confidence of the upper echelons of command. As Chief of Army and then as CDF, General Cosgrove oversaw a significant enhancement and development of the Special Forces community, culminating in the raising of Special Operations Command in May of 2003. This process in itself, and just as one example, has changed the nature, structure and the culture of the ADF. Overall, the crisis in East Timor ought to be seen as the start point for complex processes and complex operations that unfolded for the ADF in the years that followed. What does all this mean then for the Official History series? In terms of the historical philosophy behind this series, I suspect I differ very little from my predecessors. Official histories are, in many ways, a record of government actions and decisions based on government sources. They are not government stories, however, or means by which certain narratives might be perpetuated at the expense of others. They are the product of investigations by independent researchers. The government pays the bill, it doesn't decide what goes on the page. Official histories are also, as I've mentioned, a foundation and framework for future historians and an accessible way for the public and the veteran community to gain insight into the operations under examination. I think this is particularly important today given perceptions perhaps of a disconnect between the wars under study and the wider Australian public. I think it important too, given what might be described as a mismatch between some of the public narratives about Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan and the historical record at hand. Our outlook has been straightforward. We don't self-censor, we include the bad with the good, for frictions and mistakes are as valid a part of the historical record as unbridled success. Achievement in spite of institutional shortcomings, in my view, enhances the legacy of those involved, not the reverse. So we write as we see it and where the evidence trail leads. These volumes therefore aim to be truthful, not necessarily triumphal. Of course, the enduring impact of these works, beginning with the first volume to do with East Timor in '99, will be up to you and future historians to judge. Thanks, Tom.